we're reading this book right now. It's called To End All Wars by Ernest Gordon. And it's a book about prisoners of war during World War II who were forced to build the notorious Railroad of Death in a prison camp at the river Kwai. And if you aren't very familiar with this time in history, as you can imagine, it's a time of war, so there's dehumanizing happening on all sides. In order to kill other people and to act violently, you have to treat people as less than human. And the author is writing about his experience in this camp where people were treated very cruelly, unjustly. They were forced to work beyond their body's capacity. They were beaten, fed small amounts of rice. Many of them got sick and were not given the medical attention that they needed. And the book actually begins with the author sitting in what they called the death house. This is where they dropped and left all of the dead bodies. And he had gotten so sick that he could no longer work, and so he was useless to them. And so they left him with all of the dead bodies, people who had died. And what's interesting about this story is that while they're in this incredibly challenging circumstance, while death surrounds them, they actually become more alive. They find creative ways of cultivating life and love and hope in the midst of a very despairing situation. They find themselves transformed by Jesus and his radical love. And the book has stories about men sacrificing their lives to get food and medicine for their friends who are sick. They find creative ways of helping each other survive and just improving morale. They learned that most of the illnesses that the men had stemmed from protein and vitamin deficiency. And so they realized that through fermentation, the fermentation process actually produced vitamin B. And so they let rice ferment in water and then use these liquids as medicine because it had vitamins in it. And then when they realized that was actually awful to drink, that it tastes horrible, they learned to distill alcohol and use that to sterilize the instruments that they use for surgeries and things like that. There were men who made woodwind instruments out of bamboo, a bass violin out of a tea box, and dried cow guts. And they had an outdoor concert. And even with all of these creative efforts and this sacrificial love, I'm sure that what they were up against felt insurmountable. People were still dying. And while they were coming alive and they were experiencing the love of Christ and they were living it out in practical ways, there was death everywhere, all around them. And I wonder if they regularly found themselves wondering if it was all in vain, like swimming upstream. And while this comparison seriously minimizes their situation, I wonder if it would be like trying to keep your house clean when you have kids. You clean up the house at night and then the next morning the toys are out everywhere all over again. Why do we even try to keep things clean? For the last couple months, we've talked about what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? How do we actually follow Jesus? What does that look like? What are the markers? And now 2 months later, we find ourselves in a very different situation. And we might be wondering practically, what does it look like to follow Jesus? How do we follow Jesus in this season, in this moment? And not only how, like practically, but actually how? Like, how do I do that? How can I be the hands and feet of Jesus when the challenges feel insurmountable and when we're surrounded by really despairing and challenging circumstances? 2 weeks ago, we read a passage about disciples in a storm. And there's actually 2 passages in Mark where the disciples find themselves in a storm, very afraid. And we're going to take some time this morning to look at the second passage. This is in Mark chapter 6. And what we're going to do is break you up into groups. And so in your groups, you're going to read the passage. Maybe one person can read the passage for everyone. You can follow along. It's in the document that you were given. And just take a moment to discuss, like, if there's anything that strikes you about this passage. What is unsettling? What makes you uncomfortable? So take a few moments to do that. Joel's going to break us up into groups. We'll come back at 10:30. So just keep that in mind in your discussion. So maybe everyone has a chance to share. So we'll bring you back at 10:30, read the passage, and then discuss those questions. What's unsettling? What strikes you about this passage? So I'm curious what you guys talked about in your groups. What was unsettling? If anyone wants to share.
It seemed with our group, a lot of people kept mentioning or seemed to be unsettled by the fact that that despite already seeing miracles or seeing Jesus work or seeing something that should have proven to us that something bigger was at work, that they still held this belief, that they couldn't accept it or they still struggled with it. Which I imagine most people find unsettling. We see it, every day with everything, our politics. Why do people hurt people when we know better in theory and such? So that's what seemed to be the main kind of thought in our group, I think.
Yeah, because this is right after Jesus feeds thousands of people with a couple loaves of bread and some fish, and then, like, the disciples doubt Jesus, right? So, yeah. What else?
Well, for us, we we happen to be talking about a bit about just how people happen to be jumping from panic to panic, where it's first they were worried about the wind and the storm, and then as soon as they saw Jesus, instead of saying, "Oh, it's our friend and savior, we can calm down a bit," they saw, "Oh, it's a ghost," and so now it's like, what else? Now there's more problems for us to deal with.
Yeah, so they're already afraid of the wind, and now they're afraid of a ghost. Anyone else?
We noted in our group the kind of phrase in verse 48, I guess it is, that where it says he intended to go past them. And some of us had not noticed, myself included, noticed that before. And it's kind of weird. It's like Jesus was just going to like walk right on past. It seems weird also.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's very weird. It's very interesting that the disciples are struggling. Like, my translation said they were in serious trouble. And first of all, Jesus sees them and then waits until dawn, or like somewhere between 3 a.m. and dawn, to come help them, but then intends to go past them. Like, I just imagine Jesus like walking on water, and he's just gonna like moonwalk like right past them as they're struggling in the boat against the wind. Like, tensions are high. This could be a life or death situation. I mean, can you just imagine this for a second? I'm sure their situation in the boat feels like the situation in your house right now with your family. Like, tensions are high. Everyone's just on top of each other. Like, I could just hear James, saying, "John, you're not rowing fast enough." And Philip's like, "I told you we should have waited until morning." And Thomas is crying in the back of the boat, like, "We're not going to make it. We don't have enough toilet paper." And Peter's like, "Thomas, stop crying and start rowing, or we're really not going to make it." And Jesus sees them struggling, sees all this happening, and just intends to pass them by. Like, does he not care?
I wonder if he was intending to really just remind them that he was there, that he was with them, without actually intervening.
Yeah. So what exactly, like, why does Jesus intend to pass them by? And I think, Craig, you're onto something. And we actually Like, in order to answer this question, we have to dive into some Old Testament stuff, which may feel a little abstract and heavy, and I'm totally just going to nerd out for a second. But stick with me because it really brings understanding and significance into what's happening here. So in the first half of the Bible, the Old Testament, in Exodus chapter 33, Moses has a similar encounter with God where he lacks the courage and confidence for a difficult situation. And in that passage, it says that God is going to pass Moses by. And this idea of passing by is a motif in the Old Testament. It's not like God just walking by, but it's more like an epiphany. Like Moses says to God in this moment, look, if you're not with us, don't take us any further. Like, I don't want to keep doing this if you're not with us. And then God intends to pass him by. And it's like God doesn't change Moses's and the Israelites' circumstances. Moses is leading them into the promised land. God doesn't swoop them up from their difficult circumstances or their challenges, but instead passes them by and assures them of his presence and gives Moses like a glimpse of this divine vision so that Moses understands the purpose of God calling Israel, so that he knows that the work that they're doing is not in vain. And what's interesting here is when Jesus gets in the boat, he says, I am here. And the Greek is ego eimi. So this passage originally written in Greek. It's the Greek translation of God's name, I am, like Yahweh, which is also a reference to the same passage, because after God tells Moses, I'm going to make my goodness pass you by, he also says, I will proclaim the name before you, the Lord. That's the name for the Lord, Yahweh, I am. God promises to be with Moses and gives him a bigger picture of what God is doing. And it seems like that's what's happening here. Like the disciples are in the midst of this incredible storm. They lack the courage and confidence to persevere and to keep going. I mean, just imagine their numb fingers clutching the oars as they continue to row. Their muscles burning and aching, the waves crashing against the boat, their lives on the line, and they can't even see with all of the water and the wind if they're inching towards the shore. Like they don't even know if they're moving forward or if they're going in the right direction. And Jesus wants to assure them of his presence and give them a glimpse of the divine vision. To help them see that they're not rowing and working in vain. You're not just trying to clean up after your kids after a long day and the mess is going to be back the next day. There's purpose in what you're doing. It's not in vain. He wants to help them see what they're struggling for, to see this divine vision. But they can't see it. They can't see the purpose. They don't see the divine vision because they're too afraid. And they can't even recognize Jesus. They cry out in terror because they think he is a ghost. And you know what? I don't blame them for not recognizing Jesus and for being afraid. In fact, I understand. Because we're in a storm right now. And when you look around the world, when you watch the news, does it look like Jesus is with us? Could you recognize Jesus in New York, where the situation is very dire? Could you recognize Jesus with the healthcare workers who deal with ongoing paranoia? In the book of Mark, the disciples over and over again misunderstand who Jesus is. Here, their hearts were hard. They don't understand. They don't understand about the loaves, this miracle that had just happened. And it seems like they regularly mistake God and Jesus for a miracle vending machine. Like they just saw this incredible miracle happen. Jesus feeds thousands of people with a couple loaves of bread and some fish. But while God does miracles, it doesn't mean that life with Jesus is a day on the beach. It's much more like rowing through a storm. Maybe they don't recognize Jesus because they expect him to rescue them from every difficult situation. And because he intends to pass them by, they think this can't be Jesus. When you look around at our situation in the world, what if God isn't ignoring us? What if he's passing us by? What if we're uniquely positioned right now to see the divine vision, to experience God's presence like never before? In the book To End All Wars, in the epilogue, the author writes about his transition back into life. Eventually, he made it out of the camp. And he talks about how the men who, after the war, when they were transitioning, they kept looking for security. And there's this powerful quote that I included in your document. He writes, "Everyone spoke of seeking security." So these are the people who escaped the camp and the war. "But what did security mean but animal comfort, anesthetized souls, closed minds, and closed hearts? It meant a return to the cacophonous cocktail party as a substitute for fellowship, where with glass in hand, men would touch each other but never meet. They would speak, but nothing said and nothing heard. They would look at their partners, but would not see them. With glassy eyes, they would stare past them into nothingness. It meant a return to the faceless masks, to culture dragged down by the level of advertising media. It meant a return to faith and technology in the big machine as their powers were used to unleash yet greater hidden forces in nature so men could find themselves more enslaved than ever and ever, readier to use those forces to bring about the total destruction of mankind. The contributions of free men seeking to serve the infinitely great in honesty, responsibility, and love would be denied." And here's like the powerful part of this quote. "In short, it meant flight from God and descent into the hell of loneliness and despair." And where in all this was the vision of the infinitely great? Where was the place for those who wished to follow that vision, inspired, sustained, and uplifted by it to find the way to serve their neighbor, and through serving their neighbor to serve God and so fulfill themselves? The vision of the infinitely great had been revealed to us by divine grace in the prison camp by the river Kwai. Now that we are back among the distractions and diversions of a materialistic world, we were determined to follow that vision. It seems like in this quote, how he's describing their situation, that in this camp where death was surrounding them, that they witnessed the vision of the infinitely great, the divine vision, that they lived out sacrificial love. And then it was almost harder once they got back. That he felt like he was being invited into a hell of loneliness and despair. I wonder right now in our situation if we're uniquely positioned to see the divine vision, to experience God's presence like never before. I know that we're rowing against the wind, that death is all around us. But I also see people coming alive. I see people doing things like Chalk Our Walk, where they encourage people to go outside and write encouraging words with chalk on the sidewalk and draw beautiful pictures. People singing songs outside of their windows to neighbors. People figuring out ways to love other people and provide for them and their needs. And this is what happens in this book, To End All Wars. People start meeting Jesus. They sacrifice their lives for others. They forgive their enemies in radical ways, the people who physically hurt them. There's a man whose bowels actually close up because the surgery went totally wrong. And he knows that he's going to die. And he meets Jesus, and he joyfully spends the last couple days of his life serving other people in any way that he can, cleaning the rags that they used to clean people's ulcers. And he does it joyfully. In this season, I imagine that there will be moments when it's terrifying. There's so much unknown. We will have regular breakdowns. Living in houses with our family 24/7, we will come to the end of ourselves. As we look around at what's happening in the world, we will weep and mourn. We will lament. And there will be times that we don't even recognize Jesus and we question whether or not he is with us. But what I love about this story is even though the disciples can't see the divine vision, they're too afraid. What does Jesus do? He gets in the boat. Unfortunately, God is not a miracle vending machine. We are not immune to suffering and challenges in this life. But when we ask ourselves, how will we follow Jesus during this time? How will we survive? I have confidence that we can because Jesus gets in the boat. We can trust in Jesus's presence for him to provide us with the courage and hope and confidence to persevere, to give us the eyes to see the divine vision, to soften our hearts, to give us wisdom and creativity to follow him during this time. So what does it mean to trust in Jesus's presence? It's just like we practiced this morning where we closed our eyes and imagined Jesus right there with us. And we handed him all of our fears. It's imagining Jesus right there with you and asking him for what you need. Patience for your family and the people that you're living with. Creative ways to love your neighbors. Hope, encouragement in a despairing time. Right now, we're going to practice and participate in communion together. This is something Jesus did with his followers. He passed around a loaf of bread and a cup of wine and said, "This is my body and my blood. Eat, drink, do this in remembrance of me." So if you can take a moment and grab your elements, your bread, your cracker, your juice, whatever it is that you have. And once you get that, I want you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine Jesus is with you, close enough to touch his body, his blood. You're on this boat and he calls you by name. He says, "Kathy, Craig, I'm here. Don't be afraid." Alex, Megan, Chris, Melinda, Jenna, Emily, Chris, Kevin, Riley, he calls you by name and says, "I'm here. Don't be afraid." And now you can take this bread, this cracker, and eat and drink. And know that the presence of Jesus is with you, close enough to touch, close enough to feel. Let me say a prayer for us. God, we are thankful in moments that feel uncertain, in moments that feel scary, in moments where we feel like we come to the end of ourselves, to the end of our patience, to the end of our ability to love, that you are right here with us, that you meet us in the boat. And God, you give us so much more than that. You give us a glimpse of the divine vision. And God, we know that you are at work right now in the world. We see it. Would you continue to give us vision to see that our labor is not in vain, even though the challenges feel insurmountable, even though it feels like we are surrounded by death, by despairing situations. God, you are at work. Would you give us wisdom and creativity to know how to participate in that vision? We pray these things in your name. Amen. Thank you, Drew. In To End All Wars, the author said, all the while our own future was unpredictable. We didn't know what the Japanese had in store for us, but whatever happened, we knew that Jesus was our leader and he would never fail us. As he had been faithful to his disciples in the first century, he would be faithful to us in the 20th century. Reunion. While the future feels very unpredictable, I am confident that Jesus will not fail us. While Jesus has been faithful to the disciples in the first century and the men in the camp by the river Kauai, he will be faithful to us right now. He is with us. So may God give you vision to see how he is working in the world, to see that your labor is not in vain. May he give you strength and hope to persevere. And may he give you peace in his presence.